In this episode of the Smart City Podcast, I interviewed Janice Lee. Janice is the Director of Infrastructure Advisory at EY and also recently joined me on the Future Leaders, Future Cities delegation to Japan. It was really great to hang out with Janice in person in Japan, and so we discussed in this episode our observations. So we talk about how Japan and Australia are approaching the smart city space differently, but also how some things are exactly the same. We also discuss work that Janice is doing at the moment in government advisory in the smart city space. We also talk about the emerging trends that other people aren't talking about in depth necessarily. So as always, I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
It's the Smart City Podcast, whoa, with Smart City experts, here we go. Connecting smart technology, both big and small. Smart cities are making life better for all. Big data, emerging trends, self-driving cars and more. The Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Janice. How are you today?
Hello. Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Let's just jump straight into this. And can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you're passionate about?
Okay. So my background is actually in government. I came from sort of central government. I live in Sydney, so I've worked in the New South Wales government and also in the federal government. I tended to work in the sort of economic portfolios, so in infrastructure, and now I work at EY. I'm a director in their economics and policy practice within their infrastructure advisory team. And one of the things we do a lot of is sort of public policy, working with government to solve problems and to think through how to optimise their policy and regulation for transport and land use and planning. I guess the things I'm most passionate about in that space really are just what public policy can do for improving the way governments think about some of the problems that citizens face and what it can do in terms of applying good discipline and data and analysis to solve those problems. So within my work, we do a lot of public policy, a lot of strategy, a lot of infrastructure and planning strategy, and a lot of that is collaborative with government, leaders and thinkers within government and within, the non-government sphere as well.
Yeah, cool. So what sparked your interest in this smart city arena?
So we've done quite a lot in the space of cities. Actually, I've had the privilege of working very closely with government around some of the metropolitan strategy work, but also on some of the long-term planning for transport in terms of making their cities and their regions work better. And I guess the common thread through all of that is really this growth agenda. Like, what is the role of really high-quality infrastructure in making cities function really well, in making them prepared for growth, in enhancing the assets that density and diversity actually brings to those cities? I think there's a huge, huge potential with that offtake of like the way in which technology is developing at the moment, just to imagine how some of those traditional infrastructure networks deliver and how they service citizens. So, we're seeing it in all of the spheres in which we're working, data, technology. They build a whole sort of series of service layers over that infrastructure that provide new ways to manage that infrastructure, optimise that infrastructure, but also new ways of engaging citizens and providing services to citizens.
Yeah, cool. So the biggest question of all, what is a smart city to you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. When we were in Japan just recently, I really was thinking that I'd see different definitions of a smart city. So what do the Japanese think a smart city is? What do the Australians think a smart city is? And like in my mind, it's really about a city that uses technology and digital enablement to improve the well-being of citizens and to improve the livability of that city.
Yeah, cool. In our trip to Japan, did you feel like that was their thoughts about how what a smart city was, or did you think they used kind of different terminology to us? I've been thinking about this a lot because they use that kind of Society 5.0, and to me that was the kind of a smart city. Whereas when we actually talked smart city, they talked a lot about technology.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So, yeah, they had this concept of Society 5.0, which was all about this new phase of human development and of social development that's enabled by technology. And that very much infuses the idea of a smart city. I think you're right. Like what we saw was different emphasis, really. Like that within these Japanese projects that we saw, there was this really clear focus on demonstrating what engineering could do. There were these great feats of engineering. Whereas my sense is that probably in Australia we have a bit more of a focus on smart cities as being part of a growth compact with citizens and communities. It's a bit more focused on how do we work with this trend of urbanisation that we're seeing to actually make sure that individuals aren't left behind and that they are able to live in this inclusive way within these very large kind of groupings of people within cities.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So why do you think that this smart city concept is so important?
Yeah, I think because cities are these vast and complex physical and social networks, and all around the world we're seeing massive urbanisation, and we all know from our travels and from our experience of different cities that cities can capture both the best and the worst of places, and they can have these incredible opportunities that are created by that density and by that diversity. But they can also have really intractable problems around affordability, safety, just all planning such that this kind of precious inventory of space that you have is used really poorly. So I guess the idea of these smart cities is to take the big picture and to plan for that and to build in layers that allow for a city to be adaptive and to be resilient and to serve its citizens better.
Yeah, I think the resilient piece is really important for the Japanese, and I think I can't speak for you obviously, but I think we saw that a lot, and they've obviously needed to focus on that, so it's kind of come out of necessity that they've implemented this, smart tech, but it was years ago, so that term wasn't around, I guess. And I think the disaster and resilience of the city really shone through with their tech piece. Would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So one of the sites that we went to, had this I think it was like a 56-story building with like foundations that went 50 meters into the ground, and it had this real time monitoring of movement within the structure of the building, it finally marked out the points at which you would see a degree of damage to the structure, and like the engineering feat of this was just amazing. And so necessarily, I think their approach to smart cities has been very much around resilience and ensuring that there's a sort of physically safe environment when natural disasters occur.
And I think it was really apparent in that space that it was about like the human. It was about keeping the city going and making sure everyone was safe. It wasn't about tech for tech's sake. And I really enjoyed that, even though it was interesting because it was nearly like stepping back in time, because there was like Windows 98 on the computer, and like some of the screens, it was really fascinating, but the technology was exactly what they needed for that, for now. But obviously it was created back, a few years ago when that was, the latest technology. And it's like, well, they didn't upgrade, they didn't need to upgrade the technology, so they just kept it as it was. And it would be really interesting to see, like, it playing out in in that disaster, whether it is exactly what they need, and in that case then it is a smart city, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that, I guess, yeah, what you're picking up there is something I sort of noticed too, in that some of these demonstrations of smart cities were considerably older than we think of smart cities in Australia. So, one of them in Kashiwanoha was about 15 years old, I think. So it's a more mature innovation society. They have applications that have been around for a little while, and you saw that when you went into these control rooms, and the sort of systems they've built around it, they're advanced, but they're also quite mature. Whereas I think some of the smart cities planning that we're doing today, it's quite new to Australia. It's a new way of thinking about places for us.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I've heard a lot of people talk about, this future technology, future city, future, this kind of thinking about that this tech that hasn't been invented yet, that's what we need to create a smart city. But it's actually, the stuff that's available now just being utilized in the most efficient and effective way that will create the smart city. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so that's definitely true. This is really that tension you see when we talk about technology. There are a lot of those debates, like at the moment in the future of mobility space. There's a real question about, will connected and automated vehicles, like will autonomous vehicles create congestion or reduce congestion, et cetera, and it kind of unusual debates, because in a way it's never about the technology, it's about how it gets used. Who adopts it, in what ways does it change the delivery of services. All of those things are what you're trying to actually understand. And likewise with smart cities, there are so many instances of technology already available that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of how they'll be used. We've in a couple of projects that we've done recently, there's just been this enormous kind of well of data that's available, and I think people are still sort of thinking, well, how do you use that? What's the right way in which to sort of harness this? What are the applications we have for it? And a lot of that is really still to be known and tested. So yeah, I think there's that huge generation of potential from some of this technology, and much of it is already there. We just haven't yet sort of reached the zenith of how we're going to use it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there obviously there is a place for the future tech as well. We definitely need to think about that, but I think maybe we get stuck on that future stuff a bit too much. And yeah, I think you're right that a lot of the tech, yeah, we've got it available now. It's just how do we utilize that, or what's that kind of mecca point, or that the most optimal point, I suppose, of how we the data and the tech and yeah, what that kind of balance is between the good and evil, and the best use of that data, I suppose. So we talked about Japan a little bit. Let's talk about Australia, and I guess we can do a bit of a comparison. But how do you think Australia is embracing this smart city concept?
So I think it's already there in pockets. You're starting to see some technology really building into infrastructure projects like smart motorways, that sort of thing. You're starting to see agencies think about how technology could really change the way they manage for congestion. And I think what I'm interested in also is you're starting to see governments think about how that technology changes the way they make decisions as well. So in the work that we did with Transport for New South Wales, we really looked at how does this technology change the way you make important decisions about infrastructure projects, like what degree of optionality do you need? The project team talked a lot about triggers, like what are the triggers for decisions, so that you're not being too prescriptive. You're allowing that you need to build in some agility into the way you make really big decisions, big investment decisions. What's the kind of role of scenarios, and where you really find very divergent scenarios, how do you make sure that your planning is vision-led? So what's the right outcome? What's the better outcome? What sort of settings do you need in place to kind of get there? So in all of those ways, you're starting to see that agility come through in the way, in areas, in the way that governments think about our cities. I guess the other thing to think about is, in Sydney, the government are looking at a third city, right? So forming a city around the aerotropolis, and that's an immense opportunity. What you get with that is a bit of a blank canvas to build those layers and to build that integration across a place. And there aren't many examples where you really get to do that in a very mature and developed country like Australia. Maybe Canberra would be one of our other examples. So that is an opportunity like no other for a smart city, to think about how to make that place digitally enabled, to make its infrastructure network very integrated.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about some of the projects and things you're working on right now. I understand you can't, talk about some of the, confidential stuff, but kind of the broad concepts of what you're doing right now. Obviously, we just went to Japan, which was, really exciting and awesome. And I'm interested to know, what we talked about this a little bit. You're on the podcast, the bonus one that we released while we were over there, but how you're going to kind of bring some of those learnings back into your current day to day.
Yeah. So a couple of questions in that. Let me unpack it a bit. Let's go with the last one.
Sorry.
I really felt inspired after our Japan trip. I saw a complementarity. We've talked a little bit about a kind of difference in emphasis between the Japanese and Australian companies, but also a slight difference in approach. I think back to that idea of Japan being a more mature innovation society. We met with some of these big corporations, which had traditionally kept their innovation in-house in these large entities, and so they were starting to think through how to offshore some of that, how to set up little teams that had a degree of independence, in other countries, in other places, that could challenge the mold and really start to do some of that innovation for them. And I think they were really looking global, and we were looking to them to sort of see, what they could do. And we found that a really interesting exchange. So I left this to Japan thinking there are some real opportunities for partnership here, and we know there are quite a few Japanese companies established in Australia and interested in sort of pipeline projects in Australia. So that there is a really important opportunity. That's kind of the last question. The earlier question was sort of what are we working on? So, like cities and smart cities and like future mobility, these things are evolutions on some of the discussions we've already been having about how to make good infrastructure decisions. So we do a range of policy, planning, strategy, business case work, and transaction work on infrastructure projects. And increasingly, we're finding these have a degree of technology or digital enablement in them. So certainly, we're evolving the way we provide our services on that front. But our cities practice itself is really evolving as well, and growing from strength to strength. We have Adam Fennessy, who's really leading that within EY. And, we've been doing quite a bit of thinking, particularly around resilience, but sort of frame we've been giving this is around there needing to be a sort of a few things that sort of sit together really tightly, and that's, resilience, citizen centricity, ecosystem collaboration, and data and tech enablement. And that really is the crux of how you bring these sort of a smart city together, if you like. And we sort of do that through a range of ways. It might be, through policy and strategy. It might be through some spatial analytics or through, formulating ways in which we can get the citizen's voice into kind of policy making. So we do sort of citizens and communities engagement and that sort of thing. We also do sort of smart cities, advice in governance and organisation and that sort of thing. So it's definitely a priority area that really permeates across the firm, really.
Cool. So it sounds like you do, pretty much encompassing the whole smart city concept in the work that you're doing. And I'm interested to know your thoughts on how we can better integrate across, the different disciplines, so government, private industry, academia, and the community.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think I'm really looking forward to seeing how that happens in a way. I think the integration piece is really the challenge because we're seeing already these pockets of like science innovation happening all over the place, but what it's missing is the piece that brings it all together. And you can see just in these sort of ways some challenges with that. Who owns data? Who owns the system? How do you make sure that those systems speak to each other and speak to citizens? And so all of that, I think is a really fruitful area for governments and for the private sector to explore in the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So let's talk about emerging trends and any that you think people aren't talking about that are really important.
So I definitely think data is one of those. How do you use it? What do we want to know? How do we build it all into something that's really meaningful and that is impactful? But I also think that integration picture across technology is going to be important. And I think what you're going to see, which I think we're already seeing in the area of mobility, is a porousness between different spheres. So, traditionally transport services were publicly planned and provided. What happens, I think, in a technology-enabled kind of world is that small players can have big impact. Startups can create things that really add a great deal of value to public services. So, how do you really foster at that systems level, that level of integration and collaboration you need, and who owns what, and how do you overcome those different barriers to make that really seamless? So all of these are really exciting developments, and I kind of want to see those big questions tackled, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think data's a big one. Like, we are talking about it, but that kind of deep understanding of what we want the data for, what decisions are going to be made with that data, who's going to own it, who's going to use it. I think those things are like deep conversations that we need to be having now before we have this kind of wave of big data coming at us. So, yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, it's been awesome to chat with you about the technical difficulties this afternoon. So thanks so much for coming on because I know you've been flat out since coming back from Japan. And I really have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Mainly through LinkedIn, I suppose. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, well, I'll put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes and people can connect with you that way. So thanks again, Janice. It's been awesome.
Thank you so much, Zoe.
Thanks. Talk soon.
Okay, talk soon. Yeah.
It's the Smart City Podcast. Whoa.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart City Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes can be found at thesmartcitypodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments for me or any of my guests, connect with me via email zoe@thesmartcitypodcast.com or via the socials. I'm on Twitter and Facebook @smartcitypod. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.